Hey everybody, I'm Vishal Ramesh and I'm an SD software development engineer at Skypoint. So just to give a brief intro about myself, I've done my bachelor's in computer science and I've been working with Skypoint for the past one and a half years. And majority of my tasks have been around today's topic. That's Genie, right? So Azure, I guess Databricks released it around 2024, and we were the early adapters of Genie, right? So we've been there when Genie was in, private preview, and when it went GA, we were the initial ones to implement Genie and take it to an enterprise level. So today's topic is going to be about Azure Databricks Genie, and let's deep dive. And it's a pretty amazing tool, and I can run you through how it has helped us as an organization overcome a lot of hurdles. And I can basically guarantee you that after this session, you will be amazed to see the performance of Genie and how you can utilize it in an organization or even individually, right? So moving on, so we have our, you know, what is Genie, right? So Genie is basically a text to SQL model, which is powered by AI. So we have data that is landing in our Unity catalog where all our data is just present there. And let's say we want insights out of this data. So the traditional method would be to, build a report, BI reports and so forth and get insights out of them. But now that we are in the era of AI, what if we can feed this data to a chatbot and ask questions on top of this data, right? So I believe the chatbot integration is something that's been trending lately. We have ChatGPT and we have all these chatbots that have been coming up lately. And what if we can train a chatbot based on our data that lies in our catalog and with all the security permissions, right? So basically making use of the data that we have and getting insights on top of it. So for today's agenda, I have a few topics that I want to cover. So basically, what Azure Databricks Genie is, what is the architecture? Maybe we'll deep dive a little bit into the architecture. I will give you an overview about that and what are the main agentic systems that are involved here. And another major aspect that I want to give a lot of emphasis is the Unity catalog, because Unity catalog is like the brain of your entire Genie, and it is the data source. And the data source is very important for security and governance purpose. And some implementation and strategy roadmap, because we've been implementing it for the past 1 year and we know the best practices. We've tried the best practices, we've gone the wrong way, and then we've realized, okay, this is the right path to take. And we have all this mapped up so that new users wouldn't have to go through the pain of doing a trial and error method and so forth. And finally, we can have a Q&A session on the entire Databricks architecture and today's session. So moving forward, what exactly is Databricks? So if I have to, Databricks Genie, right? So if I have to put it in simple words, imagine, let's say your organization as a data analyst, or let's say a senior analyst who is on steroids, right? He never sleeps, right? And they never get frustrated with repetitive questions. So generally data analysts do get, you know, a lot of questions on data and they're always occupied, right? And let's say the data analyst has access to all your data and always provides the right answer. So imagine, like, I mean, this is all in our imagination. Imagine we had a data analyst who did all of this. So this is something that I would call, Genie, right? So Genie is a system. It has access to all your data and it can answer all your data questions from your organization or anything that you have, all the context from your data, right? So now moving forward, let me discuss slightly on traditional BI limitations, right? So as I mentioned, we have, we need to build reports, right? And only when we give requirements to a data analyst, we get the reports and we get the insights out of them, right? So, and let's say we want something custom. There is a report and we want some custom analysis, or, BI is more like toggling towards button. But let's say we have some questions based on the data, where the data is coming from. How did we get it? Can we move back, right? and can we move forward, and can we predict what's going to happen and so forth. So that's where there are slight limitations in traditional BI, right? So to avoid all of this is when, not to avoid, let's say, I would say to make it even better, to enhance, using Genie would be a better option with BI. So BI with Genie would make it even better because you can question the data too. You can visualize the data and later you can question the data too. So here are some differences between a traditional BI tool and Databricks Genie tool, right? So BI, we all know, is visualization and reports, right? And it's a static insight that we get. And um, Genie is more like an instant answers and you get insights out of them too. And these are like some basics that we are aware about traditional BI and what as a chatbot and what as a text interface Genie can do for us. And moving on to why Genie was revolutionary or is revolutionary is the natural language interface, right? Like that's the recent thing. We don't want to get very technical or very specific when we ask a question. So my question could be, as a, as an organization specialist, I can be like, what was a sales, Q3 sales report last week, or like, let's say, year on year comparison. That's something like very technical, right? So I would want to be very simple in very natural language. I would just be like, how did our sales do last quarter versus last year, rather than framing it very technically so that, the system to understand or even to get any insights out of them, right? And this is more of a self-service where each individual user can go and get their needs. They can ask their query and get insights out of the data. It's not personalized, I would say, but any user can go and ask any question on top of the data, right? And based on the query that gets generated from the data, it gives explanation to us. So we know from where the data is coming, how we how we came to the conclusion that this is the answer to that particular question that we have asked to the chatbot, right? So this is why I would say Genie is very revolutionary. And in the recent market, there are not much, NLP processors that are there, and text to SQL models that are present that are as good as Genie. So another advantage is what makes Genie different, right? So let's talk about the advantages, and slowly we'll move to the pitfalls and so forth of Genie too, right? So what Genie gives other than a normal chatbot, right? So there are a lot of AI chatbots recently, and how does Genie stand out, right? So the thing about Genie is we can provide Genie with business context. So business context, let's say if we are in inventory, we can give Genie inventory based business context. Like, okay, what is the fill rate, right? What is the product that is not filling the most often? We can give all these business contexts to Genie, and the model learns on top of it. So when we ask a question based on that, if my question is what was my fill rate last week, and if it already has the business context, it's very easy for Genie to answer, and we don't have to give much instructions there, right? And very transparent SQL generation. So whatever natural language that we feed the Genie, the SQL gets generated, and we can see the SQL getting generated, which I'll be demonstrating in a while. And integrated data governance. I would emphasize a lot on the data governance, because safety and security has been the biggest concerns lately with data, because data being getting available very publicly and using public sources, and your data getting leaked. This has been a major concern lately. So that's where Azure Databricks comes very handy with the Unity catalog. And Unity catalog is such a boon for Genie, because we can add a row level security. We can, set up user level accesses. If a user doesn't have access to a table, and if they try asking a question, it doesn't give them an answer, right? So we can set up all these kind of security measures and governance, and your data is in the system, right? It's not going out of the system. Unity catalog, Genie reside inside Databricks, so everything is at one place, right? And feedback mechanism. This is something very important that is present in Genie, where you can give like a thumbs up and a thumbs down and tell if the response that you got, you can tell the, the response that you got is correct or not. So, and you can also give reviews so that, the model learns from it, right? And again, enterprise security and permissions. This is something that I already covered there. If we want users to have only specific access to specific parts of the data, or even specific, sections of the data, that can be done using the Unity catalog. And since Genie utilizes the Unity catalog for this data, it's very secure. So moving on, the core values, right? So for different sections, let's say, let me cover the business users first, right? So as a business user, we would want instant access to data. There's a lot of data points that the business users have access to, but they're never able to get their answers out of them, right? And business users generally don't have the patience to write an SQL, or they sometimes are like very fast moving, so they wouldn't have the time, so they can just query it in, simple words, and they would get their answer, right? And since it's like a chat interface, and Genie has open APIs too, so which can be leveraged for internal chatbots, so that it is more of a self-service analytics capability can be given there too. And coming to data teams, so what data teams have sometimes happen is, like, there's a lot of data residing, and the data teams, they take a lot of time to analyze the data. So what Genie does is it acts like an assistant to the data teams. So if the data teams need some insights on the particular sections of the data, or some queries that they want to generate, and which speedens up their process, Genie does that, right? So reduce routine reports. Sorry. Yeah. So reduce routine report requests. So if there's a repetitive request, they can just use Genie there and get these work done very easily, right? And for organizations, like the example that I use, it can be inventory, it can be sales, it can be, any domain with a lot of data present. You can get insights of the data immediately, and it's very live. And since it's connected to the Unity catalog, it makes it very easy to give, real time insights, right? Yeah. So moving to the AI architecture of Genie, right? So what was the technical foundation that is behind Genie's success, right? So when let me first cover what a generic, or a traditional AI approach is, right? We have a single model, right? A single model does all the job. It creates, it tries to understand all the data points. It doesn't have the context. And it has the context of, even if we give context, it has a generic context, right? It is not able to, create visualization and explain and so forth, right? So since it's so generic and it's not specific to your domain, and you've not given instructions to the domain, there's not much accuracy. We see a lot of hallucinations. The answers that we get are not that promising, because we can get to know when someone, let's say there is one analyst who knows everything, rather than, specialists for each purpose, right? So obviously you would want to go to a specialist rather than a generalist. So traditional AI is more of a generalist, and Genie is more of a specialist. So that's how I would put it, right? And obviously, when you're a generalist, and there are a lot of domains, the error rates are very high. So that's when it causes hallucinations, and you get the wrong answers and so forth. So moving to Genie's compound AI approach. So what Genie does is, it's a multi-agent model where multiple agents interact with each other, so that each agent is like a specialist, and it's able to get the context of what the user is trying to ask, what is the context of the data that's present, and all of this through the metadata that's been stored using Unity catalog, that goes to a different agent. It computes, and then there's a SQL generator agent that generates the SQL query, and then there is an agent that visualization, for visualization, and gives us an overview of how we came down to that answer. So it has complete, I would say, 5 agents that does this. And at each stage, it gets verified whether it's generating the right answer or not, right? So as I mentioned, there are specific agent for specific roles. The agents interact among themselves to make sure it's giving us the right answer. And since, let's say, one agent does a mistake and it passes on the answer, and the next agent realizes it, it does pass it back and corrects its mistake. So the answers do get regenerated to make sure that you're always getting the right kind of insights and never getting the wrong insight. And again, this is the example that I took, right? Imagine having a team of specialists versus one generalist. So we would always choose a team of specialists over a generalist, right? So moving forward, so the Genie architecture, right? So what are the key components over here? So we have a like a natural language input processing. So whatever input as a user that we give in the form of simple words, that needs to be processed. And then there is a metadata agent, which lies in our Unity catalog, so that it is able to get context of the underlying data, right? And then we have multiple specialized AI agents that to understand the requirements of the user, to map it with the metadata, and then get, okay, what is the next step that we can do, right? Then after all of this is analyzed, we have the SQL generator, which using all of this context generates an SQL on top of the data. And finally we get the result, using which the visualization and the response generation agent picks it up. We get a visualization as well as the final answer, the final output to the user query, right? So this is, let me just bring up the image, right? So the input would be all of these uh, data points. That is the question that the user asks. And then we have the Unity catalog metadata where our data lies. And then something that's very important with the Unity catalog and the best practices that even we as an organization in Skypoint implement is, when we're using Unity catalog, all the tables should have all the descriptions, their tags, and their comments, so that when we're using this data for AI, we have the AI metadata has complete context on what needs to be done. And this reduces the hallucinations pretty much, right? And then we have the knowledge store, that is our instructions, our few short queries, and so forth. And we have a chat history based on a previous feedback and previous data that we've been feeding, right? So that's what gets cached in and gets used for future purposes as well. And for processing, there are, as I said, there are four complex systems, that the four agents that interact among each other. There's a query parser, there's an SQL generator, a visualization engine, and a response formatter to make sure the response that we are getting is pretty, comes in a pretty formatted way. So the output is pretty straightforward. There are four outputs that we get. One is a generated SQL to make sure that the valid source, like a trusted asset that you're getting out of it. You get some data visualizations with each query, and then a textual summary on how it came down to this particular answer, right? And coming to the foundation. So the foundation always, as I've been emphasizing, is the Unity catalog, and we need to have an SQL warehouse so that we can query the data. And obviously comes the security and permissions. What level of access does the user have? And does the user have access to so and so data and so forth? So these are all the architecture overview about Genie. So moving forward, yeah. So let me cover each and every agent, and this would, make it easier for the users to understand. Okay, Genie is a product. This is how it works. But let's understand how in the background how each and everything works, right? So for making this very easier and simple, I've added examples at each stage so that any user without even technical knowledge can be able to catch what's happening at each stage, right? So now there's a first agent which tries to understand what the query is. As a user, we give a query. Okay, what is the sales last year, right? So when we do this, there is our first agent that picks it up, right? Our query understanding specialist. What this agent does is it understands all the business terminologies that are involved in the query, So sees if there's any ambiguous query, words or anything in the query that we've given, right? And it tries to get the context out of it, and it tries to maintain a conversation history, right? So a few example on what could happen when we ask, each user can ask a prompt in a different way, right? So we need to, be specific. And sometimes this agent, what it tries to do is, even if we are not specific, it tries to get the context out of it. So when I say last month, right, the what this agent does is, okay, is it the last 30 days, the previous calendar month? It is able to understand me when I say last month to, it is able to put it down as, okay, previous calendar month, or maybe last 30 days. And maybe I can call it as sales, but in my data, it could be as revenue, right? So it is able to get the context and map the user words with the business context words that we have, right? And moving on to the second agent. So now as a user, you've given your query. The query is understood by the agent and everything is done there. And okay, now we've understood the user query completely. Now let's go look at the data once. What's there in the data, right? What is the relationship in the data? How can I get what the user wants from the data that is present, right? So that's when the metadata specialist comes in, right? And it goes through the table and the relationships that are present. And as I said, as a Unity catalog best practices, we need to have the tables with descriptions and comments and so forth. So we need to add, so it tries to get the context out of those. And then the data quality and availability. So what is the completeness of the data? It analyzes all of this. And then secondly, it checks what's the user, permission that is there to get the data out of here, right? Let's say a user is asking for sales data, but the user doesn't have access to that data, then obviously the user wouldn't be getting any data answers out of it, because he is not supposed to get any answers from the sales data because he doesn't have the permission for it, right? So all of this permutation and combination is done in the metadata specialist, right? So a simple example here is, I can call it as customer churn, but the specialist tries to, understand out of it that, okay, when there's a 90 days of no purchase, then it's called a customer churn, right? And sometimes what it does is it excludes test accounts and canceled orders. It filters out the data before even processing it, so it makes it very easier for the next agent. So now that we have the user query specialist that is done, so the user query that you've given is understood, and then we go to the data, and when we see that, okay, all the data, that points that we have, we filtered out that as well. And then moving forward, we have the main part. We need to generate a SQL query, right? So based on the user query, we need to come up with an SQL query. The system needs to come up with that. And this is the agent that does it, right? So what it does is it goes through and it follows all the organizational best practices, right? And it just doesn't generate any, generic query. It makes sure that it's the most optimized SQL query to make sure it returns the responses very fast, right? And if there is multiple tables to be joined, when I can, in my example, I'll be using some product and sales. So product and sales and customer need to be linked. The tables need to be joined, and there's some aggregations to be done there. The query generator agent does it flawlessly, right? And it makes sure, let's say I put a filter to, give me only last month's data. It applies all of these filters, right? So this is the SQL generation specialist. And then there is a visualization specialist. So now the SQL query is generated and then the query gets executed. And then building a visualization on top of it is what this agent does, right? So this is very dynamic. And in my demo, you'll be able to see how good the visualizations are, right? Based on any query that you give, right? So that's the purpose of a visualization specialist. So this is like the basic, all the agents involved for Genie, around 4 to 5 agents, right? And then comes the fifth agent. So now that you have the visualization, you have the data, and then you have the user query that's converted to an SQL query, we need to have an explanation on how we came down to this answer, right? So what are the document assumptions that we've made, right? So what are the data limitations that were there? Let's say if there are only 5,000 rows, it does mention that, okay, these are the 5,000 rows that came out of, your data inside, right? And how was the calculation done? So I remember implementing, Pareto analysis on inventory data, right? So if I ask my Copilot or my Genie to do a Pareto analysis on top of the inventory data, it does tell me how the calculation was made, right? So all of this is handled by the explanation specialist. So these are all the 5 agents that are involved when you ask Genie a question. So from start to end until you get the answer, right? So why this architecture is good and why it's so successful is, as I told you, since the agents and it's an agentic workflow, and since the agent are interacting with each other, it validates each other's work too. So there's very less scope for error here, right? So, and since we have the metadata checker agent, so it makes sure that we are getting, the data is already filtered out at the source and we're getting the right data. And as the visualization agent, we can give us better, suggestions for visualizing the data and getting, better, forming better user queries and so forth. And specialized learning, each agent improves in its domain, right? So each agent learns based on the previous interaction. So let's say a metadata agent made a mistake somewhere. In the next iteration, when the next query comes in, it makes sure to learn from that mistake and doesn't do that again, right? And feedback. So feedback is another major thing where these agents are continuously learning based on the feedback that the user gives. Let's say as a user, I didn't like the response that comes in. I'll be giving a thumbs down. And what happens is all these agents try to analyze, okay, why did the user give me a thumbs down? Was there something wrong? Was there something that had to be corrected? And keeps learning out of this um, process of feedback and refinement on top of it, right? So this is why the architecture is pretty good, the Genie architecture. And let me just run you through when I ask, I've been giving an explanation on how the agent work, but it's better if I give you an example on, how this works, right? And comparing it with a traditional AI and how Genie would pick it up. So my question would be, show me customer churn, right? So as a traditional AI, since it's a generalist, right, it would first give me a definition of churn, right? It would give me a basic calculation out of the internet. So my company's churn rate could be, I could have different definitions for it. But since it's a generalist, it doesn't know. It just picks it up something from the internet or a generic churn model and gives us an answer, right? But what does Genie's compound AI do, right? So since we have 5 agents, right? So what does a query agent do? It understands churn in your business context. So based on the instructions that you have given on your data, so my churn means 90 days, right? Based on that, it gets the context, right? So it gets the context from the query that you've given. Now comes the metadata agent. Now, as as I've already trained my Genie to know that, okay, 90 days is my, churn rate, and it knows where to go and look for this data, right? So using the metadata agent. Once that is done, it knows where the data is, it knows what's filter to apply. An SQL agent comes up and, okay, these are all the prerequisites. Here's the query, right? And once the query gets generated, you get the visualization agent comes in, creates a chart and based out of the query that comes out. And then you finally have the explanation agent on, okay, what are the data points that I had to create this query and how did I come up with this visualization? So this is a pretty simple explanation on how the Genie model works end to end, right? So moving forward, so I would just give a stop here. Does anybody have any questions till, we've completed the architecture? Do anybody have any questions till here?
Any questions? Feel free to come off mute. Feel free to type in the chat. This is a pretty good high-level overview, Vishal. Thank you. Not seeing any questions. My guess is people have questions maybe through the demo. So
Right, right. So be moving forward. Okay. So continuous learning from the organization, as I said, it has a feedback mechanism, right? So each and every query, each and every feedback is noted, and the model keeps uh, learning on top of it and learning from the negative feedbacks and also the positive feedbacks too, right? With the thumbs down and thumbs up, and it sees the patterns that the users ask in, and it tries to capture them. And next time you ask a similar kind of a question, it does answer very quickly, right? And what is the advantage of a compound AI, right? So it has a higher accuracy, right? It has transparency and has reliability, right? So all of these combined gives us a very good insights on top of the data, and having higher accuracy could lead us to the agents catch the mistake, the business context understanding, the continuous improvement, right? All of these contribute to the high accuracy. So transparency, we see the generate SQL being generated, we know the assumptions that are made, and we also can validate the business logic. So that moves to the transparency part of it. And coming to the reliability, the Unity catalog standards and the organizational standards and so forth. So this is what makes it on the whole very beneficial. And then moving on to the Unity catalog. And I would want to spend some time here because this is the base for any Genie to work very well. So I guess we're all pretty familiar about the Unity catalog in Databricks, and it's pretty great in terms of our security and in terms of our the robustness and the metadata that can be added to the Unity catalog. And moving forward, so it's Genie's knowledge base, as I mentioned, right? So it is more of a manual about your data as an organization or as an individual. What resides, what does your data define, right? All of this is stored in the Unity catalog, the dictionary, right? And the memory, how are the data related to each other, right? How are the tables related to each other? And obviously the security part of it, right? So Unity catalog isn't optional, as I told. This is a very mandatory thing to have for the success of a Genie, right? So what are the items that are linked to the Unity catalog, right? What are the advantages, right? So it gives us better answer accuracy because it gives us business context understanding and also trust and adoption and overall implementation success, right? So this is the phrase that we would like to use, that is, if you have garbage metadata, you get garbage answers out. So if we have our Unity catalog pretty uh, governed and pretty neatly maintained, the insights and the answers that we get out of it is pretty great, right? So that's why Unity catalog, I'm emphasizing a lot on the Unity catalog part of it, right? So some basics on Unity catalog, we need to have table descriptions, column descriptions, a basic business glossary that is there, the data lineage, how the data is connected, and security permissions that are in default, who has access to which schema, which catalog, tables, and so forth, right? So these are some of the basic components of our Unity catalog. And just some, we okay. Another thing in Genie is we can give some generic uh, instructions that is based on your business context. Like we previously discussed a churn, an active customer, and so forth. So as I told, Genie uses your business definitions rather than a generic business definition that's out there on the internet. So this is more specific to the organization and the business that is involved in using the Genie, right? So coming to the built-in security and governance, we've covered this a lot, right? I've emphasized on the row level security, the column level controls, the data masking options, the audit trails. So that's another important thing in security that comes is who's running the query, what query are they running, right? All of this is monitored through Genie. So we do have a pretty robust monitoring system for Genie as well, right? So based on our implementation for the past 1 year and what are the best practices and the pitfalls that we've seen with Genie is that, you know, the success patterns, we start small, always start small so that the model is able to learn out of it, right? And so there is this concept of a few shot example. So if you know the answer for one occurrence, and let's say we add that as a few shot, next time a user asks a similar question, then it makes sure to get the context out of that question, right? And it answers very easily out of it. And data sampling, that is a default thing that happens. And make sure that a domain expert with the data validates the data and is training the Genie to make sure that we get very good answers out of it, right? So this is the success patterns. The common pitfall is don't dump a lot of data in, right? And if you don't have good metadata, that is if your table doesn't have like a proper description and column descriptions and so forth, the system will hallucinate, right? And if there's not a expert validating what the results are coming out and not giving the right feedback, right? So the Genie can hallucinate there. But as I say, these mistakes are predictable and avoidable too. So we can avoid this very easily using the fine tuning and so forth, right? So now let me move on to the live demo. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope the screen is visible.
Yep, we can see.
Perfect.
Looking good.
Okay. So before I move to the Genie space, let me come to the knowledge base. So I have created, this is a catalog, and then we have a schema, and inside the schema, we have a lot of tables that we've currently been used for the Genie, right? So this is where, let's say, the organizational data lies. And an important thing that is very essential for a Genie space is the metadata, right? So the metadata in this case is the description, what is the data that lies. So just to give an overview on the demo, I've been using, I'll be using some product and sales, which is related to customer sample data. It's just sample data that I'm training on. It's very simple data set so that everybody can relate to what's happening here, right? So now if I move into a table, if we can see that there is a description for the table, which is very important for the Genie. And I'll tell you why it's important, right? Now, if I go through the description, the customer table holds data on all the registered customers. And I also mentioned the unique identifier. How does this table join with the other table, right? So all of this metadata, since I'm giving this, right, the Genie will be very easily able to capture all these data points from the metadata. So if you can see, you have added a point here that this table is important for tracking customer information and analyzing purchasing behavior. So now let's say we get a query on, give me the purchasing behavior of so and so customer. So it wouldn't think twice, but it would go to the customer table, fetch the customer ID and give us the customer name, right? It becomes very simple since the metadata agent will be able to capture this. And then coming to further metadata, we have column level comments that we give, right? So the customer ID is a unique identifier. We make sure to be very descriptive regarding the column descriptions that we give, because these are very essential for Genie to perform really well. And another common thing is make sure that the data has the right data types, right? In this case, a date should have a data type, and int, string, all of these are like basic best practices that need to be there to make sure the Genie performs really well. All right. So before I move into the Genie demo, let's just have a look into the data. And I'm pretty sure now that we have the data and everything, we need to have a proper warehouse, SQL warehouse that we can utilize so that we can run the queries and so forth. So if I have to put it down in this way, the three main components for Genie would be the catalog, the Unity catalog data that resides, and a good warehouse. So based on the warehouse configuration, that's how the faster query gets processed, right? So a better warehouse means faster query. But even with the slower warehouse, you do get the right query, but it's slightly slower, right? So we make sure that the warehouse that you are configuring, let me just show you that so that it's, the current warehouse configurations that I am using is a 2x small, and we have one active worker and so forth. So based on the business use case, we can make this a bigger warehouse. So this would just mean that we would get faster answers, right? So that's pretty much it on the warehouse. So this is a simple thing, a simple tool that we need to query the data that is present, right? And coming to our data that is present, right? So let me just open up one by one. So we first, let me pick up the customer data, right? Yeah. So when it comes to the customer data, let me just show you guys the sample data. We have simple customer ID and a first name, last name, email, city, and a join date. When did the customer join us, right? And then moving on to the products, we have some basic details on the product. I've given a good description, a pretty detailed description on what is the unique identifier and what are the pricing strategies that when the user asks us about a pricing strategy for a product, this is the table that you need to come to, right? And it does have like a category, and we've mentioned all the metadata data points that are required for this particular table. And looking at the data, let's just select a compute. All right, let me just show you an overview of the data so that you guys are familiar with what we're going to be querying. Right. Meanwhile, just let's just have a look at our sales table too. So we have, okay, our warehouse is on. Let's have a look at the data. Yep. So it's pretty simple, a very simple use case where we have the product name and what category it comes under, and what is the price for each, and what is the quantity, right? And then comes our sales table where we get to know what are the sales that is happening. Here too, we've given good description for the table and some comments, column level comments. And let's have a look at the data. So the data is pretty simple on what is the sale ID, what are the customer that's related to it, and what is the product that was sold, and the quantity and the sale date. So if you guys do notice that we have followed some best practices here. And another important thing is we have a primary key for all the tables. This is something very important if we have to join and get data out of it, right? So we see that the customer ID is common among all the tables. So we do have a common data point that we can link and query towards. So our basics are set up. We have a Unity catalog. We have the data residing there, all the description and all the comments, the column level comments are updated. We have a pretty good warehouse that is configured. And now that we have all of these data points handy, now let's come to our Genie space, all right? So creating a Genie space is pretty simple. So for folks who are not familiar with our Databricks UI. So the Genie option comes in under SQL. So under SQL, under dashboards, you get the Genie option. So creating a new Genie space is pretty simple. So I've already created one. So let me run you through the process of creating a new one, right? So when you create a new one, it's pretty simple here, where we just have to go select the data that we need, right? And mark up all of these. All of these are all the tables that are present. And once you select the tables, we can just hit on create. And when we create a new space, all right, we can name the space we have all the data here. And now let me come to the way I have uh, uh, configured, so that, this whole point was to show that how easy it is to create a Genie space, right? And this Genie space is specific to you. You can decide on who you want to share the access to or not, right? So now
Quick
come
question
moving
for you,
back.
Vishal.
Yes,
Um,
Greg. Mhm.
I'm seeing like flat tables, right? And you didn't have to create any relationships between those tables. Is it all just very metadata driven for it to like understand those relationships? And then follow-up question, what if you have, you know, models or semantic models? Does that mean the Genie, doesn't work well with those models?
Right, Greg. So to answer your questions, that was something that I was about to move on in some time, but now let's get it answered right away. So once
Oh,
we
no, no worries. If you're getting to it, sorry to jump the gun, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be, I mean, I'm going to be addressing that point right away, right? Now that we've pulled in all the tables, and once we pull in all the tables, we get some options here, right? As soon as you create a Genie space, you do get some options here to, configure or give the instructions to the Genie space. So answering your question, Gregory, we do have an option called joins, where we can set up the relationship among the tables, right? So here, if you see, I've defined the relationship. What are the, join conditions? What ID? I mean, what is the field that is going to be joining on, and the type of relationship. So this is when, we are using flat tables. But let's say, we have semantic tables that are lying there, and it's very pretty complicated to link among each other. So that's when we have the option of adding few short examples. So when we add few short examples, the more complex it is, the semantic model, we can train on top of it and, give these examples pre-made to the space, Genie space, so that any questions on top of that semantic model will be easily answered by the Genie, right? So this is so the initial setup that we did was for the Unity catalog. It's pretty straightforward, just where our data lies. And on top of the data, we can make all these changes, right? Like we can set up the relationships that are present, like the join conditions and so forth. And then we have this space called the SQL queries and functions. Because as a user and or as an organization, let's say we want a specific type of data to come out, or let's say a specific use case that is there, and we can add that. Let's say a common question that is asked by user is, what is the total amount spent by each customer. We can add this as a few short, so that this is more like an example to the Genie space. So irrespective of the complexity of the data, what Genie does is it tries to look for the few short example that is, you know closely related to the user query. Right now, this query could not be the same that the user asked, right? What is the total amount spent by each customer? The query can be like, okay, what is the total amount spent by so and so customer? Like, let's say customer X. Or what is the total amount spent by every customer in the last month? So all of these questions will be leveraged using these few shot examples that we give. Genie does perform good without the few shot example, but with the few shot example, it performs even better because it has complete context on what the user are going to be asking us, right? So that is on the SQL query part of it. And it's not just SQL query. We can add SQL functions too, which are generic, right? And that is configurable too. And coming to the main part where we add business context, right? Like if you guys do remember, in the PPT, I did mention that, okay, uh, what if my churn date is like 90 days, right? These are all business contexts that we give to the Genie, right? Or to basically to the metadata of it, right? So all of these instructions can be given as general instructions, in the form of text. So here I've given some default instructions like, okay, use the default currency as USD, and the revenue is so and so, the sales dot total amount. And okay, the average order value, this is how you'll need to calculate it, right? So these are all specific to my organization and my data that is present. So it doesn't take up a general assumption of, okay, when someone asks me what's the average order value, this is what I have to do. I can give specific instructions that my organization uses, so that the data and the response that we get is pretty aligned to what the organization needs, right? So some things that we generally play around even in Skypoint as an organization is getting the data, getting the answer is one thing, but getting it the right way, getting the right fields out of it, right? So now let's say when I ask, okay, which customer ordered the most? I shouldn't just get the customer name. I need to get the associated, let's say, the address of the customer and all these data points, right? And what is the product that he ordered? So that's when we can add those specific, instructions. Okay, when you're asked to do so for, let's say, when you're asking for a customer output, make sure to include the customer ID and the full name so that it's more descriptive, right? As just getting the answer is not a big thing, but making it look better for the user is another very important aspect of it, right? So these are the main instructions that we can give and the context that we can give to Genie. So let me cover each and every part of it in detail, right? So initially we did notice that we added the data. So this is the data points that have been used by this Genie space. And when I click on the data, there are additional things that I can do here too, right? So coming to the fact that how is this personalized, how is this metadata being used, right? So what Genie does is, if you can see here, it takes example values, it reads through your data and it caches the example data that is present, and it makes sure that it has a list of it. So next time you ask the data, any question, it is already cached. This is everything there in the context, and we don't have to train the model as of such because it's already trained. It has been taken from a metadata, right? So this is the biggest advantage of Genie is you can it takes the sample values and you don't have to feed it, right? So next, let's say a common thing that we've noticed is um clackamas OR, right? So the Genie doesn't know what OR is, but based on the example values, it tries to understand that OR means Oregon, right? So these are some things that we don't have to train the model at all because it default understands from the context of our data, right? So these are some things that are very important. So if you see here for the customers table that we've used, the description, this is the another metadata, and what are the inside customers, we have so many columns, what do they represent and so forth. Since we have already done a part of it in our Unity catalog, that is here, we don't have to do much here, but we can configure it here as well. We can edit the description and so forth and add more context here too. So this is the data part of it. And we've covered the instruction part. So there are three types: the text, that this is the business context that we give, and this is the join conditions that we can provide, or how the tables are connected with each other. And then we have the SQL queries, or few short examples that we would call it, right? That the system can readily use if a similar kind of query comes in. And some of the settings that we see is, we can name what is the title and the warehouse. We can choose multiple warehouses, but for this case, we are using the CDC, this warehouse with the specifications that we have configured it with. We can give some default descriptions and some sample questions that pop up here, so that if it's a commonly asked question, we can directly go, right? And now coming to the monitoring piece of it, right? So what are the users, and are we getting positive feedback or are we getting negative feedback? What was the request? Was it reviewed or not? All of this will be stored, right? And what is the answer that we got? Everything is stored. So as a governance perspective as well too, we have very pretty good monitoring. Has anything failed, or what are the completed ones? What are the queries that are in pending state? We do get all of these data from the monitoring piece of it, right? And coming to the history, which user has asked what kind of question, and coming to, uh, permissions, right? Which user needs to get access to this Genie space and so forth, right? So this is pretty much how the UI looks. And now that I've ran through the basic UI and so forth, let me show a demo of a query. Now, the setup is very simple. It's plug and play. We have a UI to do all of this. So there's not much technical steps involved. Just drag and drop, click and select, and then we might have to add a few shots. So that is something that, pretty easy to do because we can get the few shots from the Genie itself, right? So let me run some basic queries. So it's pretty simple. Now I have some sample questions that I've lined up, right? So when I ask, okay, show me all the sales that happened in July 2024, you guys can see that, this is the explanation agent, right? The user wants to see a list of sales transactions that occurred during July 2024, including details about the product name, quantity sold, sold date, and so forth. So this is the explanation on how we came to this conclusion, right? This is how the data comes in. And then to see what few shot that it referenced, you can get to know this is the few shot it has referenced, right? And this is the final output that we get. Uh, and let me show you guys the query that gets generated, right? So this is the query that gets generated from this user prompt that we have, right? So it was pretty simple. It just took us, 5 to 10 seconds to get us this data, right? So talking to your data has been made very easy with this step. So imagine writing this query all by ourselves. It would take us a lot of time. But now I can just ask a simple prompt and we can get the query out of it, right? And then we can further come to the visualization agent, right? The visualization agent is nothing but you can create, a bar graph based on the data that comes out of it. This is auto-generated, AI generated from the data that is present, right? So we can also uh, modify this based on once it gets generated, we can choose, okay, what kind of visualization that we need, right? This is personalizable too, right? So it's pretty on the go. On the go, I would say you ask for a prompt, the query gets generated. And once the query gets generated, what next, right? We would need a visualization for it. And that is handy too. And this is pretty robust. And all of this happens in a matter of 5 to 10 seconds, probably less than that, right? And you can ask, follow-up questions on top of it, right? How many units were sold in July 2024, right? So you even it has a pretty good conversational memory here where you can ask follow-up questions too, right? Okay, if this is my, what is the sale, then how many units that were sold, right? So it gets answers to those as well and, follow-up questions. So here it says that, okay, in 2024 July, there were 6 units that were sold. And coming to the feedback part, I can give it a feedback. Yes, this is correct, right? Maybe I can give it as, fix it. And I can tell what's wrong, right? I can tell it, it pulled from the wrong table and so forth. And if it needs a review, you can raise for a review and put, what was the issue with it. And the person who's configuring the Genie space can go and review it and add the necessary few shots that are required for, right? So let me just run another query right now. Let me ask, what are the top 3 best selling products by total quantity sold? So this is a pretty, you know, tough visualization to come up with, but we just, saw this coming in less than 5 seconds, right? I put the prompt, less than 5 seconds. We have the answer from my data. We have the query here, pretty, complicated query here. And it shows us how we came down to this conclusion. We have a query, we have the source and everything. And the added benefit is we get a visualization too, right? So if I have to see the top 3 products being sold, I can get a good visualization too. So this is like BI and AI on steroids, right? Both both the mixture of both is what we are seeing here. We do see a very pretty solid query, and we see the data, raw data, and the visualization too. So some these are the, you know, everything about Genie, right? So they do have APIs that we can leverage to, we can use it as a chatbot and so forth, right? So these are the basic use cases of Genie, and this is how um, we can, using a simple prompt, come up with visualizations and also the query and so forth. So many times, not just as, someone, as, a business user using it, but let's say as a data analyst, and, even me, a lot of times when I get lazy to, come up with a SQL query, I just go to Genie and be like, okay, this is the data I have and I need so and so. Can you generate the query for me? Right. So it can be used in multiple ways for visualization. Let's say I'm a data analyst and I want to come up with a query. I personally use Genie a lot for coming up with query. Like, I just put the text and it gives me the query right away. So it's pretty great as a text to SQL model and a natural language processing model, right? And I've been using it for the past 1 year, and it's pretty great. And most of my time goes in tuning Genie spaces, so it's pretty, in the feedback mechanism is pretty good too. And if you guys have seen, the response times are pretty great. And I've trained this on huge data models too, where the data goes in millions and billions too, and it's pretty robust there as well. It doesn't break there too. So this is pretty much an overview about and a demo of the Genie. So any questions here? So since I'm on the platform, if you guys want to explore something, if you guys want have any questions on whatever that I've shown here, you guys can go ahead and ask.
One question I have, any like considerations, like as you mentioned, hey, you're implementing Genie on some like pretty large data sets.
Mhm.
Um, are there any like tips and tricks that you think of as soon as you approach, a very large data set versus kind of what we were seeing here?
Right, Gregory. So the fundamentals remain the same. So what I mean, this is just a story from my side, right? Like initially when Genie came up and we didn't have much documentation on the best practices and so forth, what we did was just directly pull the data and start asking questions on top of it. And that didn't give us the level of answers that we were expecting. So then we realized, slowly as we started working with Genie is the fundamentals of a good Genie space is always in the Unity catalog's metadata.
Mm,
So the description, so if we come here, so that's an important thing that they've got here, right? So when you're pulling in a table, we need to make sure that it has a very descriptive description that is there on whatever computation that you'll be doing on top of it, right? And make sure, like, if there is, in this particular case, let's say our customer ID is our unique identifier. Let's make sure to mention that, okay, this is my primary key, right? So it makes it easy for Genie to understand, okay, whenever I'm using or joining two tables, this is the field that I need to use. And I've given, like, very basic description here, but we can go ahead and, make it even better, right? Like when it comes to city, I can be like, okay, this represents the city where the customer is from, and this is specific to the US, right? So when I ask questions on Clackamas OR, it doesn't hallucinate at all, and you don't need any instructions on top of it. So coming to the tips and tricks, I would say is always make sure that the Unity catalog, the metadata is up to date. And another major thing to make sure Genie is working as expected is your few shots, right?
mm,
And the thing is, our few shot also should have a pattern, right? If you're following a pattern of few shots, make sure to follow only that, and don't mix up two few shots, because then Genie will start hallucinating. Because you have the two same examples for the same use case, then that's wrong. So having a uniform few shot example is one thing, and also the combination of general instruction that we see here shouldn't contradict with your SQL query, right? Here, let's
Right.
say I am, displaying in euros, but my general instruction is telling me to display in USD, right? That's a conflict right there. So we need to be pretty careful when we give general instructions and few shot. So these are some things that we've experienced, and um, as a best practices need to be implemented to avoid any hallucination.
Makes sense. The master prompt, right? Making sure it coincides with what you're showing and the few
Correct.
short SQL
Yeah.
queries. And one thing I was wondering back at the Unity catalog, are there
Mhm.
like character limits you should be aware of? You know, typically when you're doing this type of metadata, being more verbose is better
Mhm.
if possible. I'm just wondering if there's any like limitations. Like,
Right.
and you know, is it like 1,000 characters? Is it 100? Is it 20?
Right. So the ideal trick is I've not explored the what's the maximum limit, but the thing what we do is we try to keep it more concise as possible. We don't add, additional data to it. Like over explaining always spoils the metadata quality, I would say. So
Okay,
I'm not sure about the maximum quantity, but it's better we keep it the lesser the better, right?
understood.
So if we have like a lot of context, the processing might take a hit there.
Understood. That was an amazing run through as well as an awesome demo, like end to end, clean. Thank you, Vishal.